I also have the pleasure of serving the moderator for what I know is going to be a robust and amazing discussion and presentation about the legacy of systemic and historic discrimination in housing in the United States. We will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Julian Hayter, an historian and associate professor of leadership studies at my alma mater, the University of Richmond. But before we get into introductions, a few logistics. This presentation is going to be recorded. So for those of you who have to hop off early, or for folks who couldn't make it, we'll be providing a copy after this evening. Also going to be posted onto Virginia Law Center's YouTube page by the end of the week. A big thank you to Christie Marra from the Virginia Poverty Law Center and Adele McClure from Virginia Legislative's Black Caucus for helping to make this event happen. We are going to hear from both of them later this evening to talk about how this is a part of a larger kind of effort and agenda and ways for folks to potentially get involved. We will have some time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to drop those in the chat, and I'll be tracking them as Dr. Hayter presents. And so on to why we're here and why now more than ever is a time for us to gather and have this conversation and discussion. The legacy of inequality is deeply rooted in America's system, and they persist today. As folks who I assume are coming together for the discussion, we are all dedicated to fighting housing equity and fighting for justice in housing. But we can't really understand our work or understand today's conditions without going back to get an understanding of the policies and the laws that codify discrimination that we see today in home ownership and land ownership in Black and Brown communities. And unfortunately, this history is really, really long. But what we hope is that you walk away today understanding that in order to really address these inequities, our policies and our programming must truly be restorative and reparative. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Hayter, but I would like to tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Julian Hayter is an historian whose research focuses on modern US history, African-American history, and the American Civil Rights Movement. He is the author of The Dream is Lost, Voting Rights and the Politics of Race in Richmond, Virginia. His work has been published in the Journal of Policy History, The Washington Post, New American History, and other media outlets. He also regularly contributes to national and local media outlets. Dr. Hayter, we are really honored to have you. And so I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right, so I'm just going to dive in. I'll talk mostly about housing discrimination, but even more broadly about how these patterns in housing discrimination are commensurate with life and African-American life after emancipation more generally. So and we could talk a little bit more about the Q&A if you have questions. So, foreigners have often had a pretty keen outlook on the United States. And in 1835, a French scholar named Alexis de Tocqueville actually had some pretty interesting things to say about the United States. So, roughly 25 years before the Civil War, this aristocrat, this scholar came to the United States, and he made, for all of its splendid lines and its glaring limitations about the United States, Tocqueville's observations about race have stood the test of time. And he noted that enslaved peoples were neither in nor of civil society, right? They were objects of gross incivility. And in thinking about America's strange juxtaposition of liberty and freedom, by the way, which is forged in the crucible of colonial Virginia. It's Virginia that sets the tone here. He defined the choices available to slave owners rather simply. He said that that the United States could free enslaved peoples and treat them with some degree of dignity, or perpetuate African-American serfdom for as long as possible, right? The possibility of Black freedom, Tocqueville recognized in his brief observations of the United States, intensified rather than alleviated white prejudices. We see this, by the way, in American political development. It's kind of shockingly predictable. Black possibility often gives rise to backlash. Anybody that was surprised, by the way, by what we're dealing with now after 8 years of an African-American president doesn't understand the nature of American political development and race. And Tocqueville recognized this. And he said, ultimately, America chose the latter, right? It chose to perpetuate African-American serfdom for as long as possible, even after emancipation, right? Southerners were reluctant to break the fetters of oligarchy because they'd invested everything, by the way, economically, religiously, culturally, their entire identity on the institution of slavery. Their failure to diversify economically had great future implications. And that is precisely why a variation of this oligarchy survived slavery. It outlives attempts to reconstruct the region, and it came to define Jim Crow segregation. You know, one of the things about American bigotry that's interesting is it wasn't born in the backwoods of the Mississippi Delta or the Appalachian Mountain region. It was forged, the ideological underpinnings of American race was forged in institutions of higher learning, was forged in religious institutions. You know, everybody was all out of sorts by what happened in Charlottesville in 2017, right? Do you know anything about Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, what he had to say about race and Native Americans? If you know anything about the development of race science at institutions like UVA, namely eugenics, scientific racism, social Darwinism, you have to ask whether or not the return of white supremacists to Charlottesville was an invasion or a homecoming. The idea that higher education is liberal only gained steam very recently. And the South has to come up with a lot of crafty ways to rationalize and justify the treatment of African Americans. In Virginia, by the way, where I'm at, what we see is kind of systematic stripping of African Americans' freedoms handed down by the Reconstruction amendments over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. In the Commonwealth, it's the 1901 and 1902 Constitutional Convention. See, poll taxes and literacy tests were designed to remove undesirables from the electoral process. And this direct disenfranchisement measure, it effectively removed 80% of African Americans. And here's the dirty little secret. It also removed 50% of whites from the voting ranks. Virginia had the lowest voter turnout rate in the United States in the early 20th century, and one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any free democracy in the world. You can't get off the Commonwealth's heritage industry sites, be it Monticello, Mount Vernon, without people trying to position the Commonwealth as the progenitor of American democracy. But if we actually look at the past instead of mythologizing about it, I think it tells a different story. And Jim Crow segregation is an example of this, right? It, like slavery, permanently removed the underclass from any hope of influencing government and receiving the types of public service deliverables that would have allowed their communities to meet basic challenges. Because that's really what we're talking about here, right? It's restricting resources. African Americans are tax-paying citizens during Jim Crow segregation, by the way, and they are not seeing the types of remuneration on their taxable income that we would think is commiserable with a modern society. We see in many ways a re-enslavement of recently emancipated people. Jim Crow emerges by custom, and then people use the power vested in these Jim Crow legislatures to implement it by creed. And so how do people rationalize a system of this nature? Well, they come up with all kinds of crafty ideas that I don't have to get into, but the past isn't done with us, by the way. The past often has a future people rarely expect. And the key to net worth of most Americans isn't a stock portfolio, but the equity accumulated in someone's home. It's a primary conduit to American upward mobility. It's this equity that has created generational wealth for many whites. But homeownership, which is so central, has to African Americans has been and remains unequal. I mean, gravely unequal. And we've known these stories have known this for decades. You know, everybody wants to talk about redlining because this book just came out, but we've been talking about this for decades. Throughout the country, large groups of American citizens, this is from the Civil Rights Report in 1961, by the way. This is what the government knew. Throughout the country, large groups of American citizens, mainly Negroes, but other minorities too, are denied an equal opportunity to choose where they will live. Much of the housing market is closed to them for reasons unrelated to their personal worth or ability to pay. One of the things we know, even like cities like Richmond, even upwardly mobile African Americans who had the means to buy affordable housing were precluded from doing it. New housing, by and large, they went further, is available only to whites. And in the restricted market that is open to them, Negroes generally must pay more for equivalent housing than do the favored majority, right? We've known this for some time. It goes beyond biases, right? They stated further, right? The financial community acts to a large extent on the premise that only a homogeneous neighborhood can offer an economically sound investment. Many mortgage lending institutions refuse to provide home financing for houses in mixed neighborhoods, right? Private builders often adopt views of those to whom they expect to sell and of banks upon whose credit their own operations depend. Thus, at every level of the private housing market, members of minority groups meet mutually reinforcing and often unbreakable barriers of rejection. This is the federal government in 1961, in black and white, in the Civil Rights Report. They knew what was going on. Well, why does this matter? It matters, by the way, because more people live in cities now than at any point in human history. It is a profound demographic shift, right? And it's not just a profound demographic shift in the United States, although, right, it's continued to pace. More people are living in urban spaces now. And these cities, in some ways, have struggled to escape the way the past shaded their development. I mean, the cities don't grow organically, man. They just don't. Cities are a series of decisions. Nearly every inch of a city has been planned by public officials. I don't think that's going to shake out. During Jim Crow, people bring their biases to bear on housing markets, urban planning, the nature of public space, and the like. I mean, does anybody think, I mean, if you just go back and look at some of the redlining documents, right? They were explicit about what they were doing. They had no reason to hide it, by the way, because it's just like, forgive me for going off. This is like what I teach the Holocaust to my students, right? And, the Nazis didn't create anti-Semitism. They industrialized it, right? That stuff had been around in Europe. If you'd have walked into a bar in Germany in 1901 and said something disparaging about Jewish people, no one would have batted an eye. It was common sense. That's how people thought about the world. The same is true for race in the United States. It's the way that people thought. And they were generally held ideas, and those generally held ideas often crept into government documents. It is impossible, by the way, to understand the current unrest without urban history and the continuity of residential segregation. I can make a pretty convincing argument, by the way, that much of what we're seeing with police violence is a reflection of residential housing patterns and discrimination and the way that certain neighborhoods are over-policed and other neighborhoods are under-policed. In fact, we know, and the data shows, that whites and African Americans use and distribute drugs at nearly the same rate, but African Americans are disproportionately policed for said behavior. This goes back to the history. Redlining, restrictive covenants, urban renewal, freeway construction, and suburbanization are essential to any understanding of how we got to now. We do this a lot in popular discourse. In trying to explain quote unquote Black pathology, we leapfrog the 20th century to go back to slavery. You cannot understand what's going on in the United States right now without a firm understanding of residential housing patterns, of urban development, and the way that people migrated from rural areas to cities for nearly 100 years after the Civil War. And what we begin to see is, while segregation may have emerged by custom, and it's implemented by Jim Crow legislatures, namely in the first real legal apparatus to emerge in the early 20th century, zoning laws, right? Which, by the way, don't emerge for nefarious reasons on their face, right? They're meant to separate and design cities in a way that make them livable. Of course, though, people brought their biases again to bear on zoning laws. So the first zoning laws, wax actually passed in Baltimore in the South, and Richmond, like 72 hours later, passes one. But the federal government gets in it on the 1930s. And there's probably no more nefarious example of people bringing their racial biases to bear on public policy than the New Deal and the HOLC and the FHA, right? And in assessing financial risk for real estate development and its relationship to race and ethnicity, right? A security commissioner, Lawrence Gubbo, put to a 1949 commission on race and housing, right? A passing grade was 50 points. However, those Polish descent had to score 55 points. Southern Europeans, including Italian, Greek, Spanish, Lebanese, George, had to score 65 points. Those of Jewish faith had to score 85 points. Negroes, and look at the language here, by the way, and Orientals were excluded entirely. And what he's recognizing is this: Washington built the culture of homeownership, right? No more than 40% of Americans owned homes before the 1930s. It just wasn't something that people widely aspired to. The irony of this, I'll tell you what the irony is. It said before the 1950s, no more than 40% of Americans owned homes. Home ownership became central to American wealth building. In June of 1933, Washington passed the Homeowners Loan Act, which set aside $200 million and was given the opportunity to issue $2 billion in tax-exempt bonds. The loans applied to homes that were non-farm residential properties, did not use a house for more than 4 families, and were not worth more than 20 grand. In order to sell loans to homeowners, the HOLC bought old mortgages from banks with government bonds financed by the Treasury and capital markets. This process was deeply discriminatory, right? Well, what is redlining? I'll tell you what. I'll tell you where it was. It was damn near ubiquitous to the United States, right? It's a risk assessment tech strategy, and risk aversion was part and parcel with this process, and race became a mechanism by which policymakers back then assessed risk. So the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Association eventually used race as a determining factor in assessing financial risk, granting mortgages, doling out low and prolonged interest rates to potential homeowners. During the appraisal process, it's the FHA, they order local lenders to use color-coded residential security maps, right? Green and blue areas populated by whites were in good standing, while lenders considered yellow and red areas, often made up of Jews, immigrants, white laborers, and African Americans, high risk. Local lenders eventually gave red distinctions to almost all African American neighborhoods, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And this process of denying or jacking up interest rates on potential African American lenders, and by the way, failing to insure the homes that they did own, became known as redlining. Right, that's Richmond. If I superimposed, by the way, barring recent gentrification, if I superimposed a map of urban poverty from a 2010 census, it would almost directly correlate. This is why shit is not ancient history. Excuse my language, right? If I superimpose a map of urban poverty from a 2010 census, it would almost directly correspond with these redlined areas. This is not ancient history. We have a tendency to forget that in some ways, the shelf life of this is almost Chernobyl-esque, right? The half-life of this stuff, it just won't go away. And redlining was eventually made illegal in 1968, but the damage was done by the time of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, right? 91% of areas classified as best in the 1930s to this day remain middle to upper income, and 85% of them are still predominantly white. You want to know where the trouble spots in Chicago are in 2021? The redlined areas. You want to know where many of the trouble spots in LA continue to be? East LA. Not to be outdone, right? By the way, I pulled this from a newspaper article in 2020. If you look at F, right? Many deeds still had this language on the books, by the way, and they're what's called blue laws, right? They found this in a deed in Williamstown, Massachusetts. So this isn't just the Southern. No persons of any race other than white shall use or occupy any buildings or any lot except that is that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So these restrictive covenants preclude upwardly mobile African Americans from moving out of what were becoming compressed neighborhoods. And they're compressed for several reasons, by the way. The first is slum clearance. By the way, that is a picture on the top of Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia. If you would have seen Church Hill before urban renewal, it would look like a Brazilian favela, right? In large part because before the electrification of cities, people had to live near the point of production, and the point of production was often near rivers. And so these neighborhoods emerged haphazardly over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, and they don't have codes, right? In the mid 20th century, America, for in some cases for good reasons, resolves to clear urban slums to make way for growing city centers. Redlining, unfortunately, ensured that African Americans and other vulnerable communities rarely got fair market value for their houses, right? So on the one hand, we're removing neighborhoods, but the people in those neighborhoods aren't getting fair market because of government and public and private policies. This is even in LA. I mean, this is here we are again. By the way, the bottom is Seattle. Assessors said this in Los Angeles. This is the melting pot area of Los Angeles. It has long been thoroughly blighted. The Negro concentration is largely in the eastern 2/3 of the area. Original construction was evidently of fair quality, but lack of proper maintenance is notable. Population is uniformly of poor quality, and many improvements are in a state of dilapidation. This area is a fit location for a slum clearance project. These neighborhoods, slum clearance often happen, like freeway construction, which I'll talk about in a second, in the path of least political resistance. It was often easier to clear certain neighborhoods than others, in large part because non-voters and politically vulnerable people couldn't resist in the way their white counterparts. And so the Housing Act of 1949 funded slum clearance, right? But there's something else happening here at the same time, by the way, which I don't have a slide on, but suffice it to say, there are also public housing policies that are emerging in the late 1930s and the 1940s, where many of these neighborhoods are being cleared out. People aren't getting fair market value for their homes, and they're actually losing their homes and being funneled and compressed into public housing projects. This takes place over the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. So what you see are people who were once homeowners, because of racist public policies, are being put into emerging public housing throughout the United States. And the Housing Act of 1949 cleared slums and urban renewal projects added momentum to this. And this act sets aside $1 billion in federal aid to assist localities with clearing and redeveloping slum areas, right? Redline communities were always first on the chopping block, and these efforts decimated America's inner cities. Between 1949 and 1965, officials evicted 1 million people in Chicago alone in the name of redevelopment. Many of these people ended up in spots that we now associate with disappointment, the Robert Taylor homes and Cabrini Green. In fact, when Chicago tore the Robert Taylor homes and Cabrini Green down just recently, they moved many of those people into areas that are now characterized by much of the violence that we hear about in national news in Chicago. So these are kind of demographic displacement crises that we're dealing with. And many of the people, when they move, either doubled down into predominantly Black enclaves or they moved into public housing, right? It's not over. The 20th century really has, Americans essentially, the road to modernity was not only built on the backs of African Americans in the inner city. We literally paved over generations of history to build our interstate system. And America's interstate highway system connects and divides the country at the same time. Affluent neighborhoods had the means to resist. They were called freeway revolts. Highway construction in their enclaves. Think of it this way, for those of you in Richmond, right? We have the Powhite Parkway and we have the Downtown Expressway. But the Chippenham division of that is not a freeway, right? It is an accessible road. And it is an accessible road in large part because the people who lived out there had the political means to resist freeway construction in a way that their African-American counterparts did not. And there's no mistake, let there be no mistake, by the way, that the Powhite Parkway is designed to be a wedge between Windsor Farms and everybody else. And not to be outdone, the 65-95 corridor split Jackson Ward in half, right? This is, in fact, on the right-hand side is a picture of the splitting of Jackson Ward and Navy Hill and other areas in this part of Richmond. And in fact, there was and continues to be a natural valley, right, just to the side of this freeway that would have been an opportune place to build it, right? But they cut directly through Jackson Ward in large part because it was the path of least political resistance. That is why, until recently, most of America's highways run near or cut straight through communities of color, right? And this isn't specific to Richmond. You go to New York City, you just mention the name Robert Moses, by the way, and I guarantee you, right, it'll get an argument started, especially if you follow it up with Jane Jacobs, right? This is an American dilemma in the mid-20th century. Nearly half the century, the United States invested $42 billion in building the world's most advanced network of highways. It is a work of absolute genius. There's no doubt about that, by the way. But this is the price of progress. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, the US built 48,000 miles of interstate highways. And these highways connected cities to suburbs and rural areas and cities to cities, but they gutted urban areas. Entire neighborhoods were either torn down or split up to make way for massive interchanges and wide swaths of asphalt. The new freeways also isolated many other urban neighborhoods, ushering in their demise. Combined with federal housing bills that paid developers to tear down existing housing stock and replace it with high rises, they resulted in the continued decimation of huge swaths of many cities. How's this shake out by the 1950s? Redlining, restricted covenants, freeway construction. I always have to talk, I always say this when I talk to my African-American brothers and sisters. We have a tendency to romanticize about segregation. Like, oh, we had our own stuff. Hey, we did. Guess what else we had? We had a lack of infrastructure, by the way, because we were not getting public service deliverables, right? There were 7,500 homes in Black areas of the city of Richmond that were overcrowded or African-Americans were forced to double down. African-American homes in RVA in the 1950s, by the way, the decade that most of us romanticize about when we try to think about the height of American power. There were nearly 14,000 homes in Richmond, African-American homes without indoor private toilets, 13,221 without indoor private baths, 2,600 without running water, to epidemiological disaster, by the way, is what you're looking at here. Nearly 20,500 with cold water access only. The city of Richmond failed to install modern sewage systems in the African-American sections of Churchill until 1953, right? That's not the Leave It to Beaver version of American history. And it's not to be outdone. Think of it this way. So anytime African-Americans build up their communities in the late 19th century, these public policies are tearing them down at the same time, by the way. Jim Crow era officials placed 7 of Richmond's municipal dumps and crematories in overcrowded African-American neighborhoods, by the way. By the mid-20th century, Richmond had the highest Black mortality rate of any city in the United States. That's the cost to be paid from these public policies, from the political disenfranchisement, from the freeway construction, from the demographic displacement, right? Is the compression of African-American communities into neighborhoods that were not given the types of public service deliverables that would have allowed them to thrive. In fact, on the one hand, you have these segregated spaces. On the other hand, they lack the types of, in fact, they actually put the elements of modernity into these neighborhoods because they were scared that sickly African-Americans who often worked in their homes or around their homes were going to get them sick, right? Tuberculosis rates were through the roof. There were all kinds of problems going on in these communities that are directly related to public policy. But here, meanwhile, right, freeways lead to suburbanization, what we call the crabgrass frontier. Very few people know this. The movement of people into America's suburbs in the mid-20th century is the greatest migration of human beings in the history of humanity, bar none. Never been a bigger mass movement of human beings in the history of human beings. Between 1950 and 1970, America's suburban population doubled from roughly 37 million to 75 million. By 1967, 60% of white families in the United States lived in suburbs. See, this is suburban strategy is essentially what I'm outlining. The federal government and private industries essentially let inner cities cave in on themselves while they pump money into suburban expansion. How much? A hell of a lot of it. More than half of the homes in these suburbs were bound to federally guaranteed mortgages. The irony is, by the way, the people that end up moving to these suburbs eventually end up voting, right, for conservatives, despite the fact that it's the Democratic Party that generally allowed their moving into these suburbs in the first place. With freeway construction, right, well, even as Eisenhower, right, and with federally subsidized homes. Local and federal officials guaranteed virtually no mortgages in red line districts during the same period. Washington and the private bankers segregated America. Private sector bankers and realtors virtually excluded all minorities from this process. Between 1933 and 1936, only 1% of federal total loans went to Black folks. Federal officials and American banks underwrote well over $100 billion in new housing between 1934 and 1962. Between 1949 and 1959, less than 2% of those loans went to racial minorities. This is how this shakes out. 3.3 million Latinx still live in formula redlined areas. By the way, the lion's share of Asians migrated to the United States after the Housing Act or the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Housing Act of 1968, which forbade many of these things, right? To this day in Southern California, 54% of Latinx rent, many of them in formerly redlined communities. So what does it mean? It means that the federal government created the inner city, right? I mean, I struggle with this history, man, because I was born in 1975. I'm first generation hip hop, right? No, none of this. Without this, you don't get hip hop. But I wonder, it's the same way I feel about the blues. Like I love the blues, but then I recognize, what happened on the Mississippi Delta to give rise to it. So I'm torn, right? It's the same thing here. The 20th century story of African Americans really is an immigrant story, right? Not the slave story. It's an immigrant people. Literally, the South was a foreign country for like 5 years. And African Americans are migrating out of rural areas into southern cities and out of the South into the North and into the West, wanting many of the same thing that their white immigrant counterparts want. And they build communities, viable ones, in fact, right? Before 1950, African Americans transformed from mostly rural southern populations to urban northern and western population. In 1900, about 90% of the Black population lived in the South, with a majority in rural areas. By 1970, about 70% lived in cities, a majority in the North, which means the history that I just delineated really is the history of Black folks, right? Because of this massive migration. Here's another depressing fact. Black people claimed ownership of nearly 6 million acres in America in 1910. By the 2010s, that number was less than 1 million. Slavery cannot explain that, right? It just can't. It's the systematic decimation and systematic withdrawal of resources, right? And theft, by the way. Very few people like to talk about lynching in terms of pent up sexual aggression. And but really it's as much about economic jealousy and then trumping up charges on people to take their stuff. That's what the Tulsa race riot was about, right? Because of discriminatory housing policies, Black Americans were in the central cities. By the 1980s, most cities with sizable minority populations were even more segregated by race and class. Richmond was more segregated by race and class in 1980. How's this for, thinking about the residual effects of the civil rights movement? Richmond was more segregated by race and class in 1980 than it was in 1940. So how do we, this triumph narrative? But so-called ghettos became mirrors of the suburbs. In 1947, white buyers could purchase homes in Levittown, right outside New York City, for $8,000, which is roughly $84,000 in 2015 dollars. Today, sorry about that, the median housing value in Levittown is $365K, right? The Long Island suburb built more than 17,000 homes, nearly all of which were leased or purchased by whites, thanks to racial restrictive covenants guided originally by the terms of the Federal Housing Administration's loans. If a Black family could afford to buy in a white neighborhood without government help, the FHA would refuse to insure future mortgages, even to whites in that neighborhood, because it was now threatened with integration. While African Americans are allowed to live in Levittown now, They by and large do not. The city's population is 89% white and less than 1% Black. New York City, meanwhile, is 20% Black and just 44% white. Here's the legacy. In response to the housing crisis 1960s, President Johnson announces in 1968 that Washington would extend its pro-home buying policy, including federally insured loans, to low-income buyers. They believed that new urban residents reinvigorated by homeownership would transform the blight. Well, listen, good public policy, if it's not followed up with political will, often falls flat. And this is precisely what happened. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that it's manipulated. And that is precisely what happens in the 1960s, right? Under the Housing and Urban Development Act, Section 235, the private sector set out to provide real estate agents, appraisers, mortgage brokers, and financing. Speculators and housing flippers ruined and expedited the demise of already run down housing. By 1975, foreclosures in urban areas were 7 times higher than in the conventional home lending market. What does this mean? It means that predatory lenders go into these neighborhoods and start flipping houses and selling them at higher rates. And Fannie Mae, by then, which was a private industry by then, and Freddie Mac paid $4 billion in insurance claims by the 1970s, in large part because the blight was so severe, the loans were so unequal that people who bought these homes generally couldn't afford to upkeep them, right? It was optimal. The Housing Act of 1968 ended de jure redlining and housing segregation, right? Subprime lenders saw this as a prime opportunity, by the way. This is in the 1960s, right? This is 1970s. Low-income communities with stagnant wages and rising cost of living were often ripe for subprime mortgages. Between the 1970s and the 1980s were hard on urban African Americans. I went to UVA for graduate school, and Julian Bond, I TA'd a couple classes for him. And one time I asked him, was the civil rights movement a success? It was hard for me to square the triumph narrative of the civil rights movement with this. This is what I grew up in. In 1970s and 1980s were difficult. By 1993, African Americans were 5 to 8 times more likely to have subprime mortgages than their white counterparts, right? By the way, that's Sedgwick. That's where hip hop was born. Here's a dirty little secret that has nothing to do with urban housing, but I'm just going to slip it in. Jamaicans actually created hip hop. Hip hop was created in America, but it was made by Jamaicans in Sedgwick projects. And there's a long history of this, but the first hip hoppers were actually Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, and African Americans. So there's this kind of cross-pollination going on. Anyway, federal policies of racial segregation applied nationwide, right? Pruitt-Igoe homes in St. Louis, Missouri, for example, became a national symbol of dysfunctional public housing in the 1960s. High-rise towers. This is what were packed with welfare-dependent African Americans, barely literate single parents, and their gang member children. This is how the press referred to them, right? Conditions were so bad that the federal government evicted all the residents of Pruitt-Igoe and dynamited the 33 towers in 1972. It didn't even last for 20 years. The public and media stereotype of project residents has become one of entrenched poverty and social dysfunction, right? A problem that was made by design. By 1973, Richard Nixon could describe such projects as monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, and crime-ridden. Here's how it shakes out now, right? The so-called concrete jungle. These are heat indexes, right? In areas that were characterized by the history I just delineated, this is what we're dealing with now. The increasing intensity, duration, and frequency of heat waves due to human-caused climate change puts historically underserved populations in a heightened state of precarity. As studies observe that vulnerable communities, especially those within urban areas in the United States, are disproportionately exposed to extreme heat. It's concrete, asphalt, right? Poor housing designs. At the University of Richmond, we found that in 94% of 108 cities that had historically redlined neighborhoods were nearly 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average than non-redlined neighborhoods. Though some cities showed starker differences, as much as 12.8 degrees. This is Minneapolis, by the way. What you're looking at in the middle is a red line, the red line community. And what you're looking at right, oh, sorry about that. What you're looking at right here is the heat index. Look at that. It's a direct correlation, right? This also are green, and the last one is green space, right? Trees and vegetation, and gardens, parks. This has more, right? It's not just, it's a quality of life issue that has profound implications for profound historical implications. That's how we got to now. By the start of the 1970s, 11 million Americans had purchased dwellings thanks to the FHA VA financing. Almost 1/4 of new houses in the United States during the 1940s and 1960s received FHA VA subsidy, with the high point at 40% in 1955. Levittown, Long Island had not a single African American amongst its 82,000 residents as late as 1960, more than a decade after the Supreme Court declared racially exclusive deed restrictions legally unenforceable. Levittown was not unique. Customs matter. They really matter, right? The size of each circle represents the area in that city that the HOLC graded, with each color representing the proportion of the city graded and colored. Redlining took place all over the United States. You see, right, it's most acute in the South, but it is everywhere. Now, the past is in the past. 1% of areas deemed best in the 1930s remain middle to upper income today, and 85% are still predominantly white. 74% of neighborhoods that HOLC graded as hazardous more than 80 years ago are low to moderate income today. 64% of the hazardous graded areas are minority neighborhoods now. This is from us out at the University of Richmond. Historical biases and residential patterns has given rise to racial homeownership gap in the United States. The national home ownership rate for Black families is 44%, compared to 73.7% for white families, according to a 2020 report by the Redfin real estate brokerage. The same Redfin report held that the typical homeowner in previously redlined enclaves has gained 52% less, which is roughly $212,000 in personal wealth from property value increases than homeowners in greenlined areas. So here we are. These historically economically depressed communities have been ripe for redevelopment. And unfortunately, because this history has only recently been told, many of the same historical mistakes are being, this is an old Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? We call it the great inversion, right? This journalist Alan Ehrenhalt coined this term. He argues that the roles of American cities and suburbs are changing places. Cliff Notes version. It's possible, if things continue apace, that the United States will look like European cities where wealth is concentrated in the middle and poverty and immigrant communities are on the periphery. Paris looks like this, for example, right? Young adults and affluent retirees moving in while immigrants and less affluent are moving out. This inward migration has led to a new understanding of decades-old urban crisis. This is why, by the way, people are so interested in this history. It's because they're moving into these neighborhoods and they're being exposed to things that their forebears purposely forgot, right? So what is gentrification? Hard to say, right? But the way scholars think about it is by measuring education, income, and other units of measurement at one point in time, and then measuring it again at another point in time that has been characterized by profound demographic shifts. So I'll end there and we'll open it up to Q&A. I think we can't have reconciliation without recognition, right? It's one of my old quotes, but I'll say something else. Things done on purpose can only be undone purposely. I think in America, we have a tendency to think the further we move away from our tortured racial past, that it'll just organically go away. It won't, by the way. These things were done on purpose. And I think it's going to take pointed programs to think intently about how we can undo it. And the first part of that is just coming to terms with the fact that it happened and it's continued to act upon us. Very few people know this history, but millions have lived it. Once you know the story of modern urban history, I don't think you can ever unsee it. Like, why is that freeway here, right? How much history did we lose on the road to modernity? As cliche as it sounds, understanding 20th century urban history might prevent similar mistakes in the future and in the present. As we become more urban, these problems are more dire. Knowing this history is essential to devising strategies to reimagine our urban spaces and let people and the people that inhabit them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayter.
Mhm.
That was amazing. And not because, I mean, I think we could all agree that, you know, it never gets easier to hear that, but I will say that I feel like every time I hear presentations or I'm learning about, you know, housing policy in the US, I unearth just how deeply rooted it is. And it still feels like so much room to, you know, peel, it's like peeling an onion, right? And so peeling back those layers. So thank you for going through that. We had a lot of comments in the chat, and so I want to kick us off with a question. So one thing that you said is good public policy, if not followed by public will, falls flat. And that resonated because I think, you know, Virginia over the last couple of years has been, I think, passing laws and legislation that are starting to move us in the right direction with addressing the harm done. But this idea of public will, can you just speak more to that and how important that is in continuing this momentum that we're seeing?
I just think, well, I'm a historian, so I find historical solutions to contemporary problems. I just think heightened awareness is the first step in coming to terms, right? A lot of people don't even know this is happening. So they don't, how can you understand how contemporary public policy is supposed to work if you don't understand what it's working to try to fix, right? And I think people have a vested interest in some instances in not telling this story. There's a reason why certain histories remain untold. I find it ironic, by the way, that we continue to bring up this idea of cancel culture in 2021 as if American history told in the 20th century was anything but. I dare you to open up a historical textbook from 1950s and find a woman or a person of color, right? This stuff was literally suppressed for a reason because people had vested economic and cultural interest in making sure the story wasn't told. Now we're telling the story, and I think that is essential to generating the type of public momentum we will need to carry these policies forward. We're not going to get, I think if 2020 and 2021 have demonstrated to us that there are certain people that just aren't worth convincing anymore. They're gone. So we need to work on folks who might be pliable, right? We got to understand the politics of having improbable allies and then getting people on board who are willing to carry these policies through, right?
Right. Thank you. And then another question that I have, and if you can kind of distinguish and define, what do we mean and why is it important when we say reparative policies, reparative legislation, and the importance of, you know, really thinking about the communities that have been most impacted, African-American communities, Latino communities,
Right.
and shaping and passing policy that directly addresses the harm done to those groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's going to take. It's what I meant when I said things done on purpose can only be undone purposely. That's what that means, right? It's like as you know, I think a lot of Americans still think that racism is is an act of individual malice instead of a series of systematic choices and policy decisions that have had a generational effect on certain people and not others, right? You know, and we get bogged down in conversations about white privilege. Let me tell you what this presentation is, right? You can talk about white privilege without even saying it, by the way. I'd rather talk about Black impediments, right? Because it's easier to see, right? In some ways, we know that yeah, people had to gain from redirecting resources away from African American communities. It's patently obvious, and I think once we dig into this history, we begin to understand that the only way to come to terms with the contemporary implications of these historical practices is to create not just, it cannot just be public policy. It's got to be, we need organizations, we need 501c3s, private industry to come together to try to come up with some kind of uniform, wholesale strategy to come to terms with this history. It's that complicated. It's precisely why nothing's been done, I think, in large part because it's so complicated. And it's going to take, we're going to have to get Washington off its lethargy. We have to stop moving at a glacial pace. But like I said at the beginning, I think understanding and recognition is going to be central to the strategies that we devise to try to repair the damage that's been done over the course of the 20th century. I mean, there's an unfortunate number of Americans who still believe that everything was fair after African Americans were emancipated from slavery. Right. What I just outlined to you was 100. That's what Tocqueville said was, he called it serfdom, by the way. Think about Jim Crow as serfdom. And then we begin to see that it's just a modulation of an old system, right? In some ways, Jim Crow segregation is a way to reorganize the Black labor force. People, a good slave was $20,000, $30,000. You own 100 slaves, you're wealthy, right? It'd be the equivalent of us burning up our Federal Reserve. So these people redesigned the political system to recuperate what they lost. And it had generational and century-long implications that we're still trying to deal with. As hard as slavery was to overcome for 19th to 20th century actors, we are still trying to come to terms with the legacy of Jim Crow segregation.
Dr. Hayter, we did have a question. You talked about how bias in zoning policies led to the housing landscape we have today. How important or not do you think ending single-family zoning is in moving forward and addressing housing inequity?
It's going to be an issue, by the way. There's no doubt about it. How could it not be? Zoning policies, see, this is the thing, back to your earlier question, I live in a city that has zoning policies like this, but they also have something else that expedites policies like that. They have historical tax credits and tax abatements to move into particular neighborhoods. Now, if we can do that to incentivize an inward migration of people, then why can't we come up with a graduated tax plan that helps people who have been in this neighborhood for 30, 40, 50 years with being priced out on their taxes by these increases in property values? We lack imagination when it comes to thinking about these issues. And I think in some ways that's single zoning is a problem, but it's not the only problem. There are things that are incentivizing single families to move into these neighborhoods. By the way, what's interesting about this is that I live in Brooklyn Park in Richmond on the north end. When they redo many of these houses, what they're doing is I meant when I said African Americans were forced to double down. Many houses in formerly African American neighborhoods were multi-use houses in large part because African Americans had no choice but to split their houses up to house several families. Now people are coming in here and they're undoing all that, and they're putting these single families into 23, 25 square foot houses. It's fascinating what's happening.
Just one more question. Is there data detailing the nature of the 15 million acres taken from Black Americans?
Yes. Read Andrew Carl's book. Yep. Read Andrew Carl's book. He's a historian at UVA. Yeah, there's data. He outlines it in the book, right?
Thank you. I think, if I, like many people, are probably still processing. Thank you again for being with us, for, presenting and having this conversation. I think it's given us a lot to continue to think about as we are all doing this work. So I am going to pass it over to Christie Marra from the Virginia Poverty Law Center to give a little bit more about kind of how this talk kind of connects with some of the other issues that their organization and others are addressing.
Thank you, Mariah, and thank you, Dr. Hayter. That was really a wonderful presentation, and you detailed so much in such a short time period and with such clarity and specificity. And I'm really looking forward to going back through the presentation and may even be reaching out to you for additional reading that you might be able to suggest on each of those things. So I can't thank you enough for doing this for us. And I'm so happy that we were able to tape it. That's not the right word. Record it. There you go, so that we can continue to share it. Wow, a lot to think about, and a lot of things that Dr. Hayter just talked about really support, I think, the work that the Poverty Law Center is starting to do with the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus on a program that we are calling the Reparative Homeownership Program. And this is still an idea right now. It is an opportunity for advocacy. It is just one thing that we can start to do to remedy and repair some of the wrongs that Dr. Hayter just detailed for us. The Our Home program, as we're calling it, is designed to provide folks who have historically been denied the opportunity to build wealth through homeownership, through things like redlining, those who have had homes taken away from their families in the past through the destruction of neighborhoods like Navy Hill and through the breakup and destruction of homes in places like Jackson Ward and Randolph and Richmond and other places, of course, in the state, in Norfolk and in Charlottesville and in many other places. And I will speed this up, but I will tell you that Adele has put into the chat an overview of this program that provides a lot more detail than I can provide right now. But in short, we are advocating for and looking for partners in our advocacy for a program that would pair with the down payment assistance and other programs that we have now, a subsidy program that would help homeowners make their monthly mortgage payments. And so there is lots of information in the, I think, chat. I think that Adele's either put it in the chat or she has put it in the chat. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Adele now so that she can tell you how you can get more information about the reparative homeownership program that we are beginning to advocate for and how you can get involved in the advocacy efforts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christie. And again, my name is Adele McClure, and I'm a housing advocate working with Christie and so many others on this program. So for next steps, we're excited to gather stakeholders, provide input, feedback on the Our Home program. And this detail is going to be included in the survey link that I just dropped. And we're going to be gathering virtually over Zoom on Thursday, June 10th at 4 p.m. And like I said, I dropped the link to the survey in the chat. So please fill out the survey if you are interested in attending and participating in the stakeholder meeting. And Christie and I will follow up with an email link to the virtual meeting. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to include those in the survey or reach out to us directly. So a link to the draft Our Home description and overview, like I said, is embedded at the top of that survey. And our contact information is up there as well. So we truly appreciate you all attending and listening in to this important event. We look forward to working with you all to address and redress the harms that were outlined in the earlier presentation. And like Dr. Hayter said, things done purposely can be only undone purposely, right? So we thank everyone for being here. Thank you to Dr. Hayter, Virginia Poverty Law Center, Housing Opportunities Made Equal for making this event happen. And also, again, thanks to all of you for attending and participating, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Good night, and really hope to see you soon. And just wanted to give you a couple seconds to click on that link, and we'll also send a follow-up email with that link if you don't get a chance to copy it or open it before we close out. So thank you so much, and please feel free to reach out and contact us at any time. Take care.
Yep.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.